The natural philosophers. These were the very first Greeks who wanted real explanations for the world around them. Instead of saying thunder was Zeus or the sea was Poseidon, they looked for patterns in nature itself. Thales of Miletus. Thales lived in the city of Miletus, in what's now Turkey, around 624 to 546 BCE. He wasn't just a philosopher. He worked as an engineer and was even said to have predicted a solar eclipse. There's a story about him making money by predicting a bumper olive harvest and renting out all the olive presses. His big idea was that everything came from water. Sounds simple, but it was a massive step because he was searching for one natural principle instead of blaming the gods. That's why Thales is remembered as the first philosopher in Western history. One line tied to him is, "All things are full of gods." It shows he hadn't completely left religion behind, but he was already moving in a new direction. Next comes Anaximander, also from Miletus, living roughly 610 to 546 BCE. He was a bit of a pioneer. He drew one of the earliest maps of the known world, and even built simple tools to measure time. Unlike Thales, he didn't think everything came from one element. Instead, he said it all came from something much more abstract. The apeiron, which means the boundless or the infinite. Everything in the world, he argued, comes from this endless, undefined source. That idea pushed philosophy forward because he wasn't just picking an element, he was suggesting an underlying principle of reality itself. He once said, "The boundless is the source of all things." Heraclitus. Heraclitus from Ephesus in modern-day Turkey lived around 535 to 475 BCE. People called him the Obscure because his writing was so cryptic. His big idea was that everything is constantly changing, and he used fire as the symbol of that change. He's the guy behind the famous river analogy. You can't step into the same river twice. His philosophy was basically that the only constant in the universe is change itself. For that reason, he's remembered as one of the most original voices of early philosophy. His short line sums it up perfectly. Everything flows. Empedocles. Empedocles came from Acragas in Sicily and lived between 494 and 434 BCE. He wasn't just a philosopher. People also saw him as a poet and even a healer. His main contribution was the idea that the world is built from four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. To explain how these combine or separate, he added two forces: love and strife. Love brings things together, strife pulls them apart. His theories influenced science for centuries because people really did think those four elements made up everything. One of his most striking lines was, "The nature of God is a circle of which the center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere." Finally, there's Democritus from Abdera in northern Greece, who lived around 460 to 370 BCE. He's sometimes called the laughing philosopher because of his cheerful outlook. But his real claim to fame was the atomic theory. He argued that everything is made up of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms, moving around in empty space. It was way ahead of its time, basically anticipating modern science by more than 2,000 years. Democritus's philosophy was hugely influential because it offered a mechanical, natural explanation for reality. He once said, "Nothing exists except atoms and empty space. Everything else is opinion." The classical philosophers. The natural philosophers focused on nature. Philosophy in antiquity moved from natural science to ethics, politics, and knowledge. Socrates lived in Athens from 470 to 399 BCE. Unlike the earlier natural philosophers, he didn't care much about what the world was made of. He cared about how people should live. Socrates worked as a stonemason at one point, but he's remembered for constantly questioning people on the streets of Athens. He never wrote anything himself. Everything we know comes from his students, especially Plato. His method was to keep asking questions until people realized their own contradictions. That's why we talk about the Socratic method even today. He was hugely influential, basically setting the foundation for Western ethics. Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth and was sentenced to death. Before he drank the poison hemlock, he's reported to have said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Plato. Plato, born in Athens around 427 to 347 BCE, was one of Socrates' students. After Socrates' death, Plato founded the Academy in Athens, which is often called the first university in the Western world. He's famous for the idea of the forms, the belief that beyond the physical world we see, there's a higher, eternal reality of perfect shapes and ideas. For example, every circle we draw is imperfect, but the perfect form of a circle exists somewhere beyond this world. Plato's influence has been massive, shaping everything from philosophy to Christian theology. A famous line from him is, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." Aristotle. Aristotle was born in Stagira in northern Greece in 384 BCE and lived until 322 BCE. He studied at Plato's academy, but he didn't fully agree with his teacher. While Plato believed in eternal forms, Aristotle thought we should focus on studying the world we actually see. He was a true all-rounder. He wrote about logic, ethics, politics, poetry, biology, and physics. He even tutored Alexander the Great. Aristotle's influence lasted through antiquity, the Middle Ages, and even into modern science. He once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." Early modern and Enlightenment philosophy. Philosophers now mixed reason and science, asking how we know what we know and how society should be organized. This time focused on reason, science, and the individual. René Descartes. Descartes was born in France in 1596 and lived until 1650. He trained as a lawyer but became one of the most influential thinkers of his time. He wanted absolute certainty and knowledge and believed reason was the key to finding it. He's the one behind the famous line, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes also helped shape modern mathematics and physics. His influence was huge because he laid the groundwork for rationalism, which became central to Enlightenment thought. Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 to a Jewish Portuguese family, and he worked as a lens grinder. He developed a radical view of God and nature. For him, they were the same thing. Everything in the universe was part of one infinite substance. His philosophy got him excommunicated from his religious community, but later he became a key figure in modern rationalist philosophy. Spinoza's work influenced both philosophy and political thought. One of his well-known lines is, "The more you struggle to live, the less you live. Give up the notion that you must be sure of what you are doing. Just leap." John Locke. Locke was born in England in 1632 and died in 1704. He studied medicine but is remembered as the father of liberalism. Locke argued that the mind starts as a blank slate, and that knowledge comes through experience. He also believed in natural rights, life, liberty, and property, ideas that influenced the American and French revolutions. His work shaped modern democracy and political philosophy. A famous line from him is, "No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience." George Berkeley, pronounced Barclay, was born in Ireland in 1685 and lived until 1753. He became a bishop, but is remembered as a philosopher of perception. His key idea was that to be is to be perceived, meaning that objects only exist because they are observed by a mind. For him, reality was essentially mental, not physical. His influence carried into debates about idealism and perception. His line sums it up: "To be is to be perceived." David Hume. Hume was a Scottish philosopher, born in 1711 and died in 1776. He was a skeptic who questioned how much we can ever really know. He argued that we can't actually prove causality. We just see patterns and expect one thing to follow another. Hume also wrote about human emotions, saying reason is often the slave of the passions. His skepticism shook Enlightenment philosophy and influenced later thinkers like Kant. A sharp line from him is, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions." Immanuel Kant. Kant lived in Königsberg, Prussia, from 1724 to 1804. He never traveled far from his hometown, but his ideas traveled everywhere. Kant tried to bridge the gap between rationalism and empiricism. He argued that while knowledge starts with experience, our minds actively shape it through built-in categories like space, time, and causality. Kant's work set the stage for much of modern philosophy. His famous line, "Science is organized knowledge. Wisdom is organized life." 19th and early 20th century philosophy. Time period, 1800s to early 1900s. The Enlightenment was all about reason and science. But in the 1800s, philosophy started pushing into new areas: history, politics, religion, even psychology. Thinkers now explored how history unfolds, how society changes, and what it means to be human in a rapidly modernizing world. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was born in Germany in 1770 and lived until 1831. He taught at universities and became one of the most complex philosophers of his age. His big idea was that history moves forward through a dialectical process, a clash of opposites that produces something new, called synthesis. For him, history was basically reason unfolding over time. His influence was massive, shaping later philosophy, politics, and even Marxism. A line often tied to him is, "The only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history." Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1813 and lived until 1855. He's often called the first existentialist. He focused on the individual's relationship with God and the importance of making personal choices. Kierkegaard thought that living authentically meant taking a leap of faith. His work was largely ignored in his lifetime, but he later became hugely influential in modern existentialism. His famous line, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." Karl Marx. Marx was born in Germany in 1818 and died in 1883. He studied law and philosophy, but spent most of his life writing and organizing politics. Marx argued that history is driven by class struggle, and he believed capitalism would eventually be replaced by communism. Along with Friedrich Engels, he wrote the Communist Manifesto. His ideas changed politics forever, inspiring revolutions and shaping the 20th century. One of his lines, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in England in 1809 and lived until 1882. He studied natural history and famously traveled on the HMS Beagle. His breakthrough was the theory of evolution by natural selection, which he explained in On the Origin of Species in 1859. His ideas reshaped biology and challenged traditional views of human origins. Darwin wasn't a philosopher in the traditional sense, but his theory had massive philosophical consequences. He once said, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." Sigmund Freud. Freud was born in Austria in 1856 and lived until 1939. Trained as a doctor, he founded psychoanalysis, the first major theory of the unconscious mind. Freud argued that much of our behavior comes from hidden desires and conflicts. He introduced concepts like the ID, ego, and superego. Freud's influence went way beyond psychology. He changed how people thought about themselves in the 20th century. One of his well-known lines is, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways."